libertarianism is pro-immigration, pro-market, pro-trade.
More competitive, less centralized. Not military confrontations, but peaceful interaction.
The war on drugs has been actually an unmitigated disaster.
The Germans and the Japanese explicitly. And so we're going to hear FDR talk about, hopefully this sound works, we're going to hear FDR talk about what exactly needs to be done in terms of war mobilization and what needs to be expended in order to do that. So we'll listen to that.
We are planning our own defense with the utmost urgency, and in its vast scale we must integrate the war needs of Britain and the other free nations which are resisting aggression. This is not a matter of sentiment or of controversial personal opinion. It is a matter of realistic, practical, military policy, based on the advice of our military experts who are in close touch with existing warfare. These military and naval experts, the members of the Congress and the administration, have a single-minded purpose: the defense of the United States. This nation is making a great effort to produce everything that is necessary in this emergency, and with all possible speed. And this great effort requires great sacrifice. I would ask no one to defend a democracy which in turn would not defend everyone in the nation against one privation. The strength of this nation shall not be diluted by the failure of the government to protect the economic well-being of its citizens. If our capacity to produce is limited by machines, it must ever be remembered that these machines are operated by the skill and the stamina of the worker.
So we can see how FDR is foreshadowing the kind of mobilization that's going to need to take place on the part of the federal government to spring an action in World War II. This comes a year plus just about before Pearl Harbor, before we were attacked by the Japanese. And we can see in his language, he's talking about mobilizing in order to build fleets and planes and tanks and guns and so forth. And then we're going to see the response, which actually comes a couple of years later, and I think it's a fantastic response from Truman as the head of his Senate committee. And he talks about corruption and how we need to be economically efficient in order to make sure that we're not wasting so much in wartime. Now this comes, of course, after we're attacked. And real quick before I play the audio, just a massive shout out. All right, I'll go back.
Program the world has ever.
So real fast, just a massive shout out to the Truman Library. They were able to provide me with this information. This hasn't really been widely disseminated to the public. So you guys are pretty much part of the first group of the public for quite some time that has heard this. This was broadcast on I believe it was Kansas City radio station, where Truman and the Democratic Committee actually bought some time to talk to voters on the eve of the 1922 midterms. So here's what Truman has to say in response to the kind of waste that's being implemented by the administration.
Our president has given us the most gigantic armament program the world has ever known. This program has been ratified by the Congress, which has appropriated and authorized the expenditure of billions and billions of dollars. Our plan calls for planes, tanks, and guns, and ships to keep the supply lines open. America must become a reservoir of ships, planes, tanks, and guns, and all other supplies of war. Not one American life must be lost because of a shortage of equipment on the American battlefront. However, we must be practical and realistic. We know that war programs in the past have been hindered by profiteering, graft, and fraud on the part of a selfish minority. We know that all too often in past wars, indecision and inaction on the part of important government officials impaired the effectiveness of the program. No factor must be allowed to impede this war program. We are determined that the billions of dollars spent on the armament program shall be effectively and economically expended. The Senate National Defense Committee was created in the early part of 1941 and directed to make a constant check into the activities of government defense agencies. When a great peace-loving nation changes its way of life from peace to war, when industry changes from its usual peacetime production to that of war, it can be expected that some confusion and error will result. Some of our problems can only be solved through trial and error. However, When mistakes are made, they must be corrected at once. The functions of Congress include passing laws and voting money to make them work. But our job isn't done when we vote. It is also our duty to make sure that the laws are carried out and the people's money is spent efficiently and economically.
So you can see Truman's response here. He talks about waste. He talks about fraud directly. And this is to a president in his own political party. And we can see how effective the Truman Committee will become by aiming to combat the lack of organization on the part of the War and Navy departments. Of course, this was before we had a Secretary of Defense. They also wanted to provide transparency and cost effectiveness, so they basically want to tell taxpayers, this is how much money you're essentially putting towards the war effort. And finally, Truman actually calls citizens out to report improper, suspicious, illegal acts that are going on near them on part of the federal government. So we'll talk about some of that waste that was found. So first of all, this guy, the Secretary of War, which is the office, which is the predecessor to the Secretary of Defense, actually goes in 1941 to testify to the committee, and he says, yeah, we're actually giving up quality in order to have the quantity of our bases, whether that's across the country or elsewhere. Most of this happens domestically. So he's saying we're definitely getting rid of any semblance of quality in order to mobilize quickly for the war effort. And of course, this is in 1941, so right at the beginning of the war for the United States. Also, the committee finds out some shady contracts that happened within the War Department. There was a man who was detailed to have been working in World War I as a builder and whatnot, and it turns out that they were just paying him off to get all these contracts signed and mobilize for the war effort. And finally, I think one of the biggest cases is this military base that was being built in San Luis Obispo, California, where they didn't even have an adequate water supply. And instead of using less money to move to a different location, I believe it was the Army who said, well, we're just going to go ahead and do it anyway. We need to mobilize quickly, and that ended up wasting many millions of dollars. So this is the federal government at work, even during World War II. But, however, the legacy of the Truman Committee, this is all of the members, or most of them, I believe, the influence and the legacy of carries on until today. There are people who have written to Truman in the past. There are some records that you can find from the Truman Library, the Library of Congress. One of them, of which a mother of a man who was in war said to Senator Truman at the time, the common people of this country have great confidence in your honesty, ability, and intelligence. So we can see overall that from John Cabot to Harry Truman, the challenging of these sort of precepts of corruption that existed within the federal government, that existed within the executive branch, actually helped to shape better values on the part of some congressmen and some senators. But it is worth noting that the corruption still continues today, probably because there is a loss of libertarian values. And so I think that as a part of my thesis, we can see that libertarian values on going back to James Madison definitely have been promoted, definitely have been worked out through the Truman Committee, through the Cabot Committee. It's just a matter of making sure we recognize those libertarian values and being able to apply them to the next generation of politicians. So that's pretty much it for the bulk of my lecture. But are there any questions, comments, clarifications whatsoever? Anything regarding Harry Truman's committee? Anything regarding John Cabot? Yeah.
So how much support did Truman have in his committee in Congress to oppose the executive?
Initially, not very much. He came out mostly saying, support the Democratic Party. That's actually a part of that speech he was making, was no matter what, we still should support the Democratic Party for their mobilization efforts, but it's a matter of doing things economically and doing them safely. But however, Truman became a household name by 1944-45, not just because he was being elected vice president, which is another interesting story all in itself, but overall, he definitely gained a lot of traction with a bunch of people as time went on. Yeah.
I was going to ask if Roosevelt knew that Truman was investigating him, what, you said it's an interesting story behind how Truman, of all people, became Roosevelt's running mate in 44 and eventually VP. What is the story behind that?
So Roosevelt knew that there was a Truman Committee, but it was more so that he was seeing it as an investigation of wartime fraud. So it wasn't necessarily a dig at Roosevelt. Truman was actually very vocal in support of Roosevelt. which is what actually allowed the Democratic establishment to support him for vice president in 1944 against the incumbent vice president Henry Wallace, who was seen as soft on the war. So actually what the case is with that and Roosevelt's perception of the Truman Committee was he probably, I would assume, he probably saw it as something that was needed, but not necessarily something that was directly warranted. It was sort of Truman's own prerogative to go ahead and get that started. Any other questions? Yeah.
How is this applicable in today's terms as we look at today's politics?
So I think if we look at the libertarian principles of that James Madison outlined, the checks and balances, we can see that they're applicable all throughout history. I could have talked about Watergate. I could have talked about any number of congressional investigations. I could have talked about committees that tried to get Bill Clinton impeached. But I think that these two hold the most significance because we can look at them today and say, well, someone like James Buchanan was using a lot of sentiments much like our current president. And if we're not careful, we don't, see through the facade that's being pushed by parts of the federal government, we won't have as much political effectiveness. And that goes way beyond political obfuscation, and it goes beyond political division. But I think that these are the two best examples for how we should model executive action going forward, or I should say congressional action going forward. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for listening to my presentation. It was a lot of work to put together, but I really appreciate you coming out. And yeah, that's what this is.